Shall we get started? And people will join us as we go along, hopefully. Okay, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the 4th online event of 2021 and the 8th in our series of talks hosted by the Compassionate Friends. My name is Carolyn Bryce, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Compassionate Friends in the UK, and also, as many of you know, a bereaved parent following the death of my daughter in 2004. It's so good to see so many of you with us in the Zoom room, and also a warm welcome to the many others who may be watching the live stream of this event through our charity's Facebook page. Just a few items of housekeeping before we continue with our evening together. Firstly, I want to let you know that we're recording this event so that those who weren't able to be here can listen at a later date, and you can listen again if you wish. And your presence here, as usual, indicates that you consent to this recording. Everyone's been muted, as we'll probably have more than 200 people joining us. So we ask, please, that you use the chat function should you wish to respond and comment after Joanne's talk. We would really respectfully ask you to keep the chat to the absolute minimum during Joanne's talk, as it can sometimes be difficult to listen and concentrate on our speaker if there's a lot of chat during while the speaker is talking, if that's okay. After Joanne has spoken tonight, we warmly invite questions, comments and feedback, which we would then ask you to put in the chat, please. And you can do that by clicking on the chat icon on your screen and then typing your question or comment. I'll try and field those questions for Joanne for her response after she's spoken. And we plan to finish our time together tonight by around 8:15. So thank you to everyone who registered to attend, and to those who were able to offer us a voluntary donation when you booked. We're really thankful for your support, especially at this time when so many charities are struggling for funds. Your donations have been really important to us and have helped us to continue to offer peer support during the pandemic and adapt our services as we try to find understanding, comfort, friendship and hope through the fog of grief and loss together. As you're probably aware, these online events have been running since summer last year and have offered us all some very special and extraordinary opportunities to listen to inspiring speakers who are themselves bereaved parents or siblings and hear firsthand their personal perspectives on loss and grief. So it's absolutely no exaggeration to say that I am incredibly thrilled tonight that Dr Joanne Cacciatore accepted our invitation to be our guest speaker. Joanne kindly joins us through the wonders of technology from her home in Arizona in the States, where it's late morning time for her. I've just now met Joanne for about 20 minutes, but I feel like I know her really well as I've been following her beautiful and helpful posts on social media for many, many years. I wanted to just offer you a few words about Joanne by way of introduction, as I'm sure she'll tell you something more about herself as she speaks to us this evening. Joanne is a bereaved mother herself, and for more than 25 years, she's devoted herself to helping traumatically bereaved people all over the world. She's been researching and writing about grief for many years in her role as Associate Professor at Arizona State University. She's an acclaimed public speaker, as well as founder of the non-profit organization, the MISS Foundation, dedicated to providing support to families who experience the death of a child of any age and from any cause. Joanne is also an ordained Zen priest, and we've just been talking to her about the care farm in Arizona, where the traumatically bereaved can work with and look after animals who have been rescued from abuse and neglect. Joanna is author of the remarkable book, Bearing the Unbearable, Love, Loss and the Heartbreaking Path of Grief, and the companion book, Grieving is Loving. It's a wonderful compendium of grief wisdom, full of compassionate words for bearing the unbearable. I've just finished reading both books, and what founts of compassion and wisdom they are. Bearing the Unbearable is a beautifully written book, growing out a sense of intensely lived experience. As Jeffrey Rubin, who wrote the foreword to the book, comments, this book offers hope for those who their loss has disconnected themselves from humanity and the circle of life. There is something for everyone in this garden that will restore and rejuvenate. And I hope you will find some connectiveness together, and with our speaker tonight, some restoration and rejuvenation perhaps. Of course, you may not agree with everything you hear today from Joanne or from others who ask questions, or it may be that she describes what she described as not how it is for you. However, this evening, our hope is that you find something, even just one small thing, in what Joanne says that resonates with you and gives you perhaps a chink, a glimpse or more of light and hope from what can sometimes feel a fog of despair and darkness as you grieve for your child or sibling. So a warm welcome to the UK, Joanne, and to the Compassionate Friends. Thank you truly for taking the time to be with us today. And we're looking forward so much to hearing from you.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm honored. It's a tragic privilege to do this work. I wish no one had to do it. I wish children didn't die before their parents, and yet here we are together. I think what makes it even slightly more bearable is each other and being able to share in moments like this. So thank you for having me here. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So I just will give you a little bit of background on myself and how I came to this work, because very few people would actually come to this work without some personal experience. My fourth child died in 1994. I found myself down a very dark abyss of trauma and grief and didn't know how to cope, and found most therapists to be unhelpful, not really understanding the experience I was having from the inside, and feeling like they wanted to usher me along in the grief that I was feeling. And I didn't feel like I had a place for the holding of my grief and my pain and the processing of my trauma. And so I thought, how could it possibly be that this experience can feel so lonely and so isolating and so misunderstood by so many, including people with whom I had closest relationships before my daughter's death. So what was interesting to me is some people who showed up, I didn't expect to show up, and people I expected to show up didn't know how to show up, which was quite a surprise. So I went back to school. I was a single mom, went back to school, and decided to study this and become a researcher in the field. And that's what I do now at Arizona State University. So the book Bearing the Unbearable came out in 2017, and I was thinking it would help a few people, and it ended up helping a lot more people than I expected to help. I still get emails from people every day who have read the book and who feel like it has shifted their relationship with their grief and feel like it has helped them in very, very meaningful ways. And so for that, I'm grateful and wish that it didn't have to be written. So I'd like to start just by sharing some emails from people in my work. This comes from an older woman who I ended up meeting. She says, my daughter Jackie died in 1956. Back then, we didn't do anything to remember them. I never even saw her. I went on to adopt 4 Korean war orphans. They are all grown and I love them very much, but there has always been this empty hole in my heart. And another. And this was a recent email that came because I was looking for a particular piece of art for the care farm, for one of the areas on the care farm. And when I found the piece of art that I really wanted, I reached out to the artist and said, you know, this is why I would really like this. Can I purchase one? And his email back to me was, thank you for reaching out to me about my work. When I saw your website, I just wept. My brother died by suicide when he was 17 and I was 14. I'm 67 years old now, and I have never dealt with that grief, but it has followed me my whole life. And another, when my mother died, I was barely 20. Now I'm almost 60, and I realized that in some ways I was frozen at 20 My life stopped. My life as I once knew it ended, and I died. And another. When I was 6 years old, my mom went to the hospital to get me a baby brother. He died. He never came home. Instead, a woman who was not my mother and who would never again be the mother I once knew lived in our home. She died a different woman at age 76. These are the kinds of emails and messages I get from people every single day doing this work. And so it's become quite apparent to me as both a human being and as a practitioner and as a grieving mother that what Catherine Porter wrote about loss is true, that the past is never where we think we left it. And so in my work, one of the things that I see is the effects that grief has that are so far reaching. Give me just 10 seconds. My cat is stuck. Sorry.
Sorry.
One of the perils of living on a farm. This is Dell, and she was stuck. Oh, no, Dell. My sincere apologies.
You gotta love it when...
I'm sorry, I just closed the door. Say, I'm very sorry, everybody. Very sorry. My apologies. So the effects of grief are far-reaching, and they're far-reaching in our body and our mind and our existential self or soul. And even beyond that, they're far-reaching through generations. And this is the one thing that I wish that we as a culture, even as a global culture, could understand more about grief, is that these effects reverberate through history and they reverberate through family systems. And I'm sure that some of you probably know what I'm talking about, because there may well be occasions where some of you have had a history of traumatic grief in your family system, and you've seen the effects of that, not just because of your own loss, but because of the family history of loss. For example, my mother, her name is Josephine, and she is the third Josephine. So my grandmother's first child died at about age 2. And then she went on to have another child, and that child died at about 8 or 9 months of age. And that child was Josephine. So the first 2 were both Josephines. And then my mother was the third Josephine. But my grandmother never spoke of her first 2 children who died. And I knew you always had a sense that there was some big family secret that no one was sharing. And my grandmother was a relatively emotionally disconnected person. She did not know how to connect closely. She did not know how to care or nurture. And I feel like that probably had something to do with it. No one in the family ever really spoke of it. I only found out after my own daughter's death, and it was years after my own daughter's death that I found out. And so there's this intergenerational effect that happens as well. So the interesting thing about the death of a child is that in the research, we call that traumatic grief. And the reason is because the death of a child, even when the child has a long-term illness, is never something we expect. I work with families sometimes whose children are dying, and sometimes people think anticipatory grief means that you're prepared for it. But when we're talking about a child, it's just not the case for most families. Some may have thought they were prepared, but then when their child died, they didn't actually feel prepared. And so there's this trauma piece that often gets missed when we're talking about this. There's trauma, and not all trauma brings grief. And then there's grief, and not all grief is traumatic. But there's a place in this Venn diagram where they overlap, where where a loss is both trauma and grievous. And so that's where most bereaved parents, in my experiences doing this work for a quarter of a century, that's where most bereaved parents sort of live, in that space of traumatic grief. That's why it has such a profound effect on the body. And so trauma is a very measurable reaction. in the body that can occur. Some of you may have felt it as panic or anxiety because it's all based in fear. Some of you may have other children or other loved ones, and now the fear of losing someone else may have come up for some of you. For some of you, it's just the dread of living in a world where something so awful can happen. And that's sort of the edge of trauma that we often miss when we're talking about traumatic grief, or grief generally speaking. I know that there are many emotions that I hear from families who are bereaved. The emotions range, and one of the examples I give is a grief umbrella. Let me find my grief umbrella. I pulled it up so that I could tell you. I did my own grief umbrella recently. And so what I say is that grief is not this sort of monolithic emotional experience, that within the umbrella of grief on each spoke can be a different emotion, sort of all part of grief and all important parts of grief to see and to realize, and that those spokes can change sometimes. So, for example, fear, terror, despair, anguish, guilt, shame, blame, loneliness, disconnection, mistrust, anger, envy, jealousy. What else do I have? Some of you, I'm sure some of you have your own words: shocked, stunned, frozen, rageful. And then there can be other emotions that are things like connected, grateful, merciful, hopeful, enduring, courageous, vulnerable, open, serene. Grief is many, many things. And so what's really interesting is that, as I don't know how far along everyone is in their grief, probably various points. Acute grief often looks quite different than grief that occurs later. And so some of these other emotions, when we make space for them, can sometimes come in as we make space. And the metaphor that I sometimes use for myself is a house or a room. So this is one room. This is my library. And I have a thing about books, you can tell. But let's say that in this library, all around me, I'm newly bereaved, and grief takes up all the space in my room. Grief is everywhere, floor to ceiling, corner to corner. Grief, because I'm newly bereaved and there's no space for anything but grief. My mind is going round and round and recirculating the details, or feeling so deeply that there's no space for any other feeling. Well, as time passes, it's not for me as much that grief becomes smaller, but that I start opening doors and windows to other rooms. And so I'll open the door, and now I can walk into the other room, or I can go outside, or I can extend this room, I can add to this room. And so it's not so much that grief gets smaller in my experience, it's that I've expanded. My house is bigger now, and I have room and space for other things other than just the acute and intense pain of loss, which is something for which I'm deeply grateful, because my life, as opposed to, for example, my grandmother's life, my parents were immigrants and had a lot of financial, social, emotional struggles, psychological struggles. My cat is talking. Sorry. Can you hear her? She's being very naughty right now. Normally she's really quiet, which is why I thought it was okay to have her here. Stop it, Delicate. Be a good girl. So my grandmother, her world became smaller and more contracted. And her emotions, because she didn't ventilate them, she didn't allow them to move, she didn't make space for them. There was nothing else in the room. There was no other space for anything else. And so that's a really tough place to come from. And I knew that I didn't want that to be my experience. And so I talk about a concept in my practice and research called fully inhabited grief. And it's this idea of fully inhabiting the room where grief is and really being with it and knowing it so well that it becomes so familiar that it doesn't frighten, overwhelm us anymore. And it certainly isn't the enemy anymore. If we live our lives with grief as our enemy, we're going to waste a lot of time trying to push it away. There's a lot of energy that we expend trying to hold it back, suppress it, repress it, deflect it. But if we can learn to have an amiable relationship with our grief, then everything starts to shift in that space. And we actually start to get more space. This is the magic of practicing mindfulness too, is getting more space in the mind and the heart. And so this is a really, has been really important for me in my work and in my work with clients, is teaching them to fully inhabit grief, teaching them to be with what is without needing to change it, teaching them to let the grief be, take up all the space in the room, and that when they're ready, they can open some doors and open some windows, maybe add on to the room, expand it a little bit, and then life gets bigger instead of smaller. It's an interesting concept and certainly flies in the face of most sort of modern day hegemony around trauma and grief. So what we know from traumatic grief, and I'll try not to bore you with research, but what we know with traumatic grief is that it often overlays a lot of social and emotional problems that show up in family systems. And this can be through generations. And there is actually an increased risk of some physical health issues for people who are both traumatized and grieving. And in my experience, anecdotally and empirically, the more time we spend trying to control, manage, or push down grief, the more energy from our body we use. And so the key becomes, how do we, as grieving people, create space within us to feel our emotional range while simultaneously engaging with the outside world in a meaningful way? And so this is where it gets tricky, because we can't control the outside world's response to our grief. And as many of you, I'm quite sure, know, the world does not know how to do this most of the time. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of times a grieving person comes into my office and sits down and says, I'm really struggling with my grief. And I say, how's your support? And they'll say, I don't have good support. They'll say people want them to get over it. My employer told me I had to take my child's photo down at work. They've said things like, my pastor says I have to get over this and trust that this is God's will. I mean, the things that people hear from the outside world are pretty inhospitable, and I would say sometimes even reach the threshold of psychologically violent. So that becomes the really, really difficult task for grieving people, is how do we unfold, fully inhabit our grief, and share how we really feel, express that in a safe way when the world doesn't feel safe for grief. I don't have a good answer for that, except that I try to help my clients communicate clearly to people what their needs are, which doesn't always work, to be honest, because a lot of things, I think grief that's this intense, that's this big, I think it scares people mostly. Not always, but I see that people tend to withdraw from it. I'm not exactly invited to lots of parties, if you know what I mean. And so there's the individual person who's grieving in every way, which manifests in the body, in the mind, in the heart, in the emotional space, in the interpersonal space, certainly with our thoughts. But then there's what happens between us as grieving people and the outside world. So for me, how that manifested and how I learned in my own grief to engage in a world that was inhospitable was, I'm a yogi, so I teach yoga. And so in yoga, we have something called strong back, soft belly. And so I learned how to approach people with a strong back and a soft belly. So someone would say something to me like, well, at least it wasn't one of your older children who died. Really, people actually say stuff like that. And I learned how to say, because at first I was all soft belly. At first I would just go and cry, and I'd just be overwhelmed by what they said. And then I responded with all strong back, and then I would get angry, and that of course would alienate them because I would yell at them. And then I learned how to balance the strong back, soft belly by saying things like, I can understand why this might make you uncomfortable. And I also want to share with you that it's not my truth. I'm not glad that it wasn't one of my old. I don't want to lose any of my children. I don't want to lose my younger one or my older one. And I would learn how to use my voice in a way that could land on others. And there are always going to be others it just won't land on, but there was still something really important for me to be able to use my voice. And that felt really good for me to be able to say to people, look, that's not my truth. Like, I understand this is making you uncomfortable to hear about my child who died. Or for some people, children. I work with a woman who lost all three of her children in a single accident. And so, for people on the outside of that experience, when they hear that, it does sometimes overwhelm them. It does sometimes shut them down emotionally. It does scare them, especially if they have children of their own and they're thinking, oh my God, I don't even want to think about the possibility that could happen, right? And so fear can sometimes make them withdraw. So at the same time, I feel like it's also important for us to exercise our autonomous voices in a way that other people can hear. So we have this experience of grief that's very, very personal, biopsychosocial, existential, if you will. And then we have this experience of grief that happens in the social space between the I and the thou, as Bruno Bettelheim would say, right? The I and the thou. It's the space of the we. And how do we then engage with a world who doesn't really want to hear about it, or who is uncomfortable with it, or who thinks we should be, quote, feeling better by now, or, quote, have moved on by now, right? Yes, Taryn says something gets contagious. And these are the stories I hear from people. Literally, they'll be grocery store shopping, with their cart, and around the corner will come a neighbor, and they see them, and they literally will turn their cart around and go the other direction. And it's an excruciating experience for people who are grieving. And that's why I push back a little bit against the sort of pathologization of grief, because by pathologizing grief and saying, well, if the person isn't done grieving by this certain time frame, then we have a potential pathology present. If we say that, then we don't take into account what the social system is doing. And so that's almost always my first question is, how are people treating you and your grief? The person you love, your child, are they remembering with you? Will they sit and look at photographs with you or videos with you? Or will they sit with you in his or her room and pour through the mementos that belong to them? Will other people remember with you? And if they won't, then some of the, quote, pathology that the outside world sees may not be about the individual. It may be, in a sense, a kind of psychological oppression that happens when we have to pretend we feel something. It's like emotional labor. We have to pretend we're not feeling something we're feeling, or that we're feeling something that we're not. And that requires a lot of energy, and that can take its toll on our body. So it's not just the grief, it's also the energy of having to suppress and put on a happy face for the world, because that's the degree to which they're able to tolerate our emotions. So all important aspects of this. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to push back a little bit against the pathologization of grief, or the medicalization of grief. In terms of emotional experiences with families here on the farm, one of the things that I see with families here on the farm that they appreciate so much is that this entire place is intentional space for grief. So if we have someone who's on the farm, one of our clients, and they're under a tree and they're sitting there and they're weeping, maybe one of our volunteers will come and sit with them, or I'm walking by and I happen to be going somewhere on the farm and I see them and I say, would you like some time alone, or can I sit with you? And I may just sit with them there. It's okay to cry anywhere on the farm, and it's okay to feel what you feel, and no one's going to come over and try and cheer you up or imply that you should clean it up. And having that kind of intentional space is so important, and so rare in our culture. Actually, in a lot of cultures as well. It's hard to find that kind of intentional space. And so it's hard to replicate the farm experience for people, but a lot of times they'll take some of the lessons that they've learned here home with them. And some of the lessons include things like try to communicate what you need to others, try to get quiet time, try always remember when you feel like you have space to remember, always remember, ritualize in ways that make sense to you. And ritual can be a big thing, but it can also be something I call micro ritual, something as simple as, saying good morning to our child when we wake up. Good morning, Shy. Good morning, Rosie. Right? It can be something as simple as that, a way to call them back into our hearts. And these kinds of practices, I help people sort of create these practices that are really useful for them to take back into the world. Is it perfect? It's not perfect because we don't live in a perfect world. It's not perfect because people don't often know how to be with grief, and they don't often understand how really sacred and how really holy this grief is. And it's sacred and holy because it's our love, and it's our love for them that connects us to them, but it's also the grief. And that just because we're grieving, let's see, Bird by Bird, one of the authors, I can't remember her name, but it's a beautiful book. Oh, I think it might have been Anne Lamott. No, it wasn't. I'll try to remember. But she lost her father when she was 5 years old, and she was talking about her grief in this book. And she said, she referred to herself as a perpetual mourner. She's probably in her 50s or 60s now, and calls herself a perpetual mourner. And I really loved that. I really loved the way that she referenced herself as a perpetual mourner, because the idea of this dichotomization that we can't, if we're in grief, we can't be joyful. And if we're joyful, we can't be in grief. That's a false paradox. That's a false paradigm. It doesn't digitize that way. So I can be grieving, but also feel joy. And that can happen simultaneously. And so this idea of the perpetual mourner, of course, all of us are going to grieve our whole lives, but that doesn't mean we don't have moments of joy and connection. And if we take the initial metaphor I started with, which was the room, with grief taking up all the space in the room, then we open some doors and windows and we add on to the room so that it becomes more expansive. Our lives at some point, maybe when we're ready, maybe can actually become bigger instead of smaller, and more expansive rather than always more contracted. And so it's a constant movement between, of course, expansion and contraction. But ultimately, I think so many of us who are years down the road, if we've been able to fully inhabit our grief, that we do come to a place of expansion, especially when we can integrate and remember. Richard von Weizsäcker said something that I it's one of my favorite quotes that I've always remembered, that seeking to forget makes exile all the longer. The secret to redemption lies in remembrance. And it's this idea that we can remember them, and that we should remember them, and that redeems us and redeems the rest of our lives, that we aren't living meaningful lives in spite of grief, but perhaps because of grief. And that's been my experience. I know that people want to ask questions and share a little bit. So I'd like to sort of close this part of it with a poem by Marjorie Pizer, and it's called The Existence of Love. I had thought that your death was wasteful and destructive, a pain of grief I could not endure. I'm only beginning to learn that your life was a gift, and a growing and a loving left with me. I once believed this desperation destroyed the existence of love, but the fact of death has not destroyed what has been given. I am learning to look at your life again, instead of only at your death and departing. And so I think if it's okay, Carolyn, maybe invite people to a bigger conversation.
Yes, absolutely fine. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you. Thank you. Would anyone like to ask Joanne anything or comment on what you've heard from her? Perhaps maybe in the chat.
May I ask something?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, who's speaking there?
Gretchen.
Hi, Gretchen.
Gretchen.
Hi. Yeah,
I've got the same accent set here, so I'll just take the first shot. I really, the line you said, the fear of living in a world where something like this can happen. I mean, totally identify with that. In a world where I feel completely impotent, I was unable to protect my child. I don't see how anybody could convince me, that that's not true. And nobody's tried, fortunately. But how, how, I guess the question, I know there's no easy answer, but how do I go on? Is there something I have to actively do to try to move forward in that world that I know sort of almost, I would say, more accurately than I did before? Or can I just wait it out? And that feeling is going to change so that I can actually, I don't need to be terribly productive, but I do have to, make a meal and do the laundry occasionally and things like that, and not feel impotent. Is that, that's it.
Thank you. Gretchen is your name?
Yeah.
Gretchen, may I ask your child's name?
Clay. Thank you.
Yeah, Clay. So when did Clay pass?
Just under 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it was a traumatic, he stepped in front of a train. It was under the influence of drugs, and it was very traumatic. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
So there's no easy answer, of course, to that question, because I don't really know you, and I don't know your experience of the world, and of course can't know how to give advice there. I can tell you that feeling is normal for a lot of people, the fear of sort of existing in a world where something so catastrophic can happen. And also say that sometimes doing some deep work around that can be useful. Deep work around, deep clinical work around trauma and grief, deep emotional work around it. Mindfulness practice can sometimes be useful in helping us to really be with the experience of fear. For me, what was important when I had that early in my grief, the first few years, for me, what was important is learning how to go into the center of the fear and see that it was not going, the fear itself was not going to annihilate me. And I will also say that's quite difficult to do when we don't feel safe. Because one of the cornerstone important emotional experiences in traumatic grief is to feel safe. I could not find a therapist with whom I felt safe. That was the problem. And so much of my work I had to do on my own. So I can't give you a specific answer, but I can say that for me, sort of having my own practice and just slowly, because I'm a yogi, one of the things, for example, an asana is a yoga pose. So bear with me, those of you who don't do yoga. Think of stretching. And so we do an asana that looks particularly hard, and you get to this, you stretching, and then you get to the point in the stretch or the asana where your body says, that's enough, that's too much. If you go any further, you're going to rip something. Sure. So pause, stay there in the discomfort, maybe back off a little bit, but then keep practicing, keep going to that place, to the edge. See, because if we don't, then we never can. Right? So if there's an asana I'm trying to master, and I get to the point in the asana where my body says no more. If I never practice that, I never achieve that. I can never go there. Now it's a little bit the same with our emotions, that which we fear, when we touch the edge of it and then pull back from it, understandably, because it's really terrifying. If that's what we do, if every time, and we don't ever learn to stay, we just keep pulling back, then we never sort of build the emotional muscle and the technique. It's not just about sort of building the emotional muscle or psychological muscle. It's also about technique. Then we never quite learn how to get there. And so ultimately, I'd like to see you connect with a really, 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 really good guide, whatever that looks like. I don't know what your particular venue is, if it's spiritual or if you're, clinically inclined, or through a mentorship program or something where someone could help you really to process it and stay with it and get to the edge where you feel safe, pull back a little bit, but then learn to stay with it and then start to approach it and practice it sort of intentionally, every day or every other day. It's a very vague answer and woefully unsatisfactory.
No, it was perfect. It was perfect. I appreciate that model. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. There's some questions about anger in the chat. Could you say a little bit about anger and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really big question, right? Anger is, the way that I look at it, some people tend to look at emotions as good or bad or dark and light. And I don't do that with emotions. It's an emotion, right? What I ask about anger sometimes is it honest and is it righteous, right? So I work with parents whose children are murdered. Okay. Yeah, there's some righteous anger there, right? And also, I work with people whose children aren't murdered, and there's some righteous anger there. And so, what's the anger about? What's the story under the anger? I have a process that I teach clinicians called unearthing, sort of getting underneath it. Sometimes anger is the emotion we see, but it's not the most honest part of the emotion. Sometimes hurt or feeling abandoned is really the honest thing, and anger is sort of the outcome of that. And so it's about really giving ourselves space to unearth and explore what's this anger about. I don't see anger as bad, unlike a lot of people in the field who do see anger as bad. Certainly we don't want to go around punching people or kicking dogs, please. However, anger is an emotion that if we can stay with it, get curious about it, be open about it, work with it, unearth it, that can teach us a lot about our experiences in grief. So I don't see it as something to push away. I see it, and I don't see it as something to which we cling. I see it as something we can hold space for and be curious about. And then when it moves, it moves. One of the things I talk about in my book is that the word emotion, etymologically comes from a word that's movir, which means to move through. Emotion, in motion. So emotions are always moving through us. And if we don't hold on to them, but we don't push them away, then they can just be what they are without all the other things that we add to it. And that's the thing is I talk a lot with my clients about honest grief and just being able to be honest about grief and what we're feeling, whatever our grief umbrella is. Anger and rage may be in there. Okay, so let's get honest about it. What's the anger? What's the rage? Is there anything else there? Are there any other stories there? Sometimes there's stories that surprise us from childhood that come up that have to do with anger. So it's always about sort of unearthing and working with what is without needing to change it, but being open about it. I hope that's a satisfactory answer, because that's a good question, but also a really tough question.
You talk in your book, don't you, about mindful rage? Really kind of, staying with it and being mindful of, exactly what you're saying about hearing it and listening to it. Yes. There's another question here. I'd like to ask about, Claire ask about how you deal with people that aren't giving you support, especially family. I feel abandoned. Claire feels abandoned by her sister in particular. I don't know how to cope with that. Do I just have to accept it and appreciate the support where it exists? I'm almost 3 years into this journey.
Oh gosh, Claire. Do you know Claire's child's name?
I don't.
Okay.
Hello, sorry, I'm here. I've put my video on. It's Annalise.
Annalise, what a pretty name. Annalise. Yeah, Claire, the feeling of abandonment is something that I hear a lot, and that's why I felt like it was important to talk about that at the beginning, in the first part, was to sort of explore that. I hear it a lot from people feeling abandoned by family and friends. And one of the first questions I ask when I'm working with clients is, how important is this relationship to you? And if it's a really important relationship, then how do we sustain the relationship in a way that doesn't feel like you're betraying yourself, and that also protects you from feeling marginalized by this person who's very important to you? And so, for example, if I'm working with a client and they're really incensed about their neighbor who has said multiple times, said very, very inconsiderate, insensitive, or plain hurtful things about their grief, about their child who died, then I say, well, how do we avoid the neighbor? Like, how important is your neighbor? Is your neighbor your best friend? No, I don't even really like my neighbor. Okay, how do we avoid your neighbor? We can jettison that relationship, but we don't need to. Let's just kind of encircle you with people who can be gentle, no sharp edges, right? Well, in this particular case, this is your sister, so this might be an important relationship to you. It might be one of those eminent relationships. And so how do you do that? So here's the problem. If our expectations of someone we love are here and they keep kind of coming in here, then we're continuously disappointed, right? And so one of the ways that I coped with that, and that some of my clients have found useful in coping with that, is, okay, so this is where I am, and this is holy ground. This is sacred. This is my child, whom I love, who I miss, and this is my grief that's equally sacred. And I'm only going to allow people who can get that here, and everyone else, I'm going to just meet them here, because this is sacred ground. And I don't love that it puts the burden of effort on grieving people to augment our expectations, which are basic compassion and empathy. And at the same time, to sustain a relationship, sometimes that's what's necessary if the person can't hear anything otherwise. Of course, Claire, there is always the possibility of, having an honest conversation with sister. I just don't know how that would land on her, right? Maybe you've already...
I did try it, and it actually made things quite a lot worse. Okay. What you're saying makes so much sense. I think I'm just not ready yet because I'm still too angry and frustrated about it.
Yes, understood. Absolutely understood. I see you, validated, completely understood. When you feel ready, then that's a practice. And a really good therapist who understands traumatic grief should be able to help with some of that if you feel inclined, or even a good friend should be able to help with that if they understand traumatic grief. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Someone actually said to me, Joanne and Claire, once, if you put all your expectations at zero, expectations of other people at zero, and then when someone does step up and it is kind to you and compassionate and empathizes and is with you, it's such a wonderful feeling. But it must be very difficult if it's your sister and an important relationship and they're not doing it. Yeah,
it's hard.
There's another question here. How do you deal with the loss of a terminally ill child that has died when you looked after the child for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? for just over 2 years.
Yes, this is really hard. You know, days are filled and now days are not filled. Now days are filled with just agony and missing. And, how do you deal with that? I mean, grieving is part of it. And also, I think that there's a balance between trying to fill and intentionally keeping that space open to feel, right? So when I'm working with someone who has had a child who was very sick and who died after a prolonged illness, this is often what I hear, because there's so much time devoted and so many schedules have been moved around to accommodate care. There's no easy answer for that. And I don't know your unique circumstances. Sometimes we try to fill the time, and that's probably okay to try to fill the time with something that has meaning to you, if there's anything that even reaches a threshold. And then also I sometimes, depending on the people, I sometimes encourage people to leave some space open to just feel and be and go into their room and remember the care and remember all of those, all of the 2 years in your case. Do you know this person, Carolyn, their child's name? Okay. So yes, so the care that you provided to your child, to be able to sustain some of that space without trying to fill it. So I think it's always a balance. In the mindfulness community, we talk about the middle path. And the middle path means not going too far this way and not going too far that way, but sort of the middle path. So try not to fill too much. Also sort of, when you have the energy, being able to do the things that might reach a threshold of meaning or purpose in whatever way. It's of course not going to be anything like what caring for your beloved child is like. It's just, there's nothing comparable to that. But if there's a way to save intentional space to feel, while at the same time figuring out how to re-engage in life in small ways, that there's no easy answer for that. Yeah. Sorry.
There's a question here from Elaine. Please, can you say a bit about how trauma is stored in the body and ways of releasing some of the emotional trauma through physical experiences?
Like somatic work. Yes. And I'm going to speak very broadly because everyone is so different. So actually I'll speak broadly, and I'll speak as it relates to me and much of my work with some families. Okay. So embodied experiences with traumatic grief tend to be useful for some people. And by embodied experience, I'm talking about things in which our bodies are engaged. Mindful movement. Of course, I do yoga, but that's not for everybody. I have some of my clients are runners, and they experience that as an embodied sense. Any kind of physical labor that requires sweating, hard, laborious work, can be useful, can get us back in our bodies. And it can be something that's more creative, like chanting or drumming or dancing, with a nod to the ancestors of many, particularly Indigenous people. Indigenous people had a wisdom about themselves, about their experiences of loss and trauma. There's an old African proverb, hard times require furious dancing, right? And so there's this sort of awareness of how important it is to engage the sort of primal movements. I do chant. I have practiced chanting. I also teach meditation, so I'm a meditator. Some people talk about ice water therapy, ice showers or cold showers or ice water diving. There's an interesting documentary with a man, his name is Wim Hof, and it's about his experience of his wife's death and how he began to ice dive, which is perhaps some sort of inherent wisdom from ages ago. I am a barefoot hiker, so I hike barefoot. I think that acupuncture can be helpful for some people. There's a product on Amazon called the AcuMat. It's basically an acupuncture mat that I think helps get us back into our bodies, and also, in my experience with clients, has helped to alleviate some back pain for them, because it's not unusual for us to experience pain in our bodies. You can use it on your feet as well. So there are all kinds of things that I have found for me and for a lot of my clients that help that traumatic grief experience keep moving through the body. It's a little bit like a, like a pool of still water, right? Water that's not oxygenated gets stagnant, right? And all kinds of things grow in it, and we don't want to swim in stagnant water. It's kind of gross. And so some of these exercises can sort of, in a way, help things move through us so that they don't become stagnant. They're not bad in and of themselves. It's when they become stagnant and don't move. Martial arts can be an experience for some people. I've done martial arts in the past. Even things like Tai Chi, any kind of mindful movement can be really useful. Even gargling can be useful because there's something called the vagus nerve. It's the 10th cranial nerve, and there's a lot of nerve endings that come into the throat from the vagus nerve, but it's the longest nerve in the body. It goes from the cranial area down to the gut. Imagine that. How many of you have had gastrointestinal problems in trauma and grief, right? And so even gargling, because of the motion, I think maybe that's why chanting, that rhythmic chanting, right? So there are lots of things. Indigenous people seem to have a wisdom about it, so I'm often giving a nod. There are lots of contemporary writers about trauma who postulate these things, but really what we really need to do is give a nod to Indigenous people for this, because this is wisdom that they've passed down to us. Yeah. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. Could you say a little bit about guilt? Because
sure,
that comes up for a lot of us, I think, sort of feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's exceedingly rare for me to work with a grieving parent who doesn't have some guilt, some feeling of failing, having failed our child or children. Occasionally I meet someone, but it's not the rule. It's definitely the exception. And then there's another category. So there are the very, very rare people who don't have guilt. And then there's the majority who have guilt. And then there are some who are actually responsible in some way for their child's death. I work with a bereaved father who ran over his daughter twice. He backed his car, thought that he had run over a bike, and then pulled forward. And every time he would say something like, I killed my daughter, people would say, you can't say that. Don't talk like that. And he was so relieved when he met me because I didn't say that to him. I said, let's talk about what that feels like. Because for him, his reality is he has to find a way to live with this. That his action, even though unintentionally, that his action caused the death of his child. But the fact that other people sort of marginalized that experience for him and said, you have to push that to the margin because it makes us really uncomfortable when you say that. If it's uncomfortable for other people to say it, what must it be like for him to feel it? And so there's that group of people who actually did something, either always unintentionally, but either through neglect or through some kind of accident, caused the death of their children or child. Okay, so the larger group in the center, which are the parents for whom their guilt is not as direct. What I do is listen. I mean, there is something about being a parent that gives us this sort of sense of omnipotence, that we should be able to know things before they happen, and we should be able to prevent all bad things. And if I would have just seen this, or if I would have just done this, or if this just would have happened in just this way, then this could, or if I was a better parent, or if I was, there are the stories we tell ourselves. And in some cases, maybe that's true. And in a lot of cases, maybe it's not true. But I don't feel the need to, again, I don't see any emotion as a bad emotion. And I don't see emotions as good emotions. I just see them as emotions. And so I try to create a holding space for that and explore it without judging it, without trying to make it go away. Now, it's the same thing with these other parents over here who actually do have a more direct relationship to the guilt because they actually did cause their child's death. And in that case, then there's a lot more unpacking to do there, right? There's a lot more there's a lot more exploring to do because their direct action is what caused the death. And certainly other people saying, you can't talk like that, you can't say those things, that most people have not found to be very helpful at all. So I just create the space to talk about it. And I have my own guilt. And it makes people quite uncomfortable. I tell people, sometimes I'll say, yeah, I'm responsible for my daughter's death. I am a direct cause of her death. And people it's amazing how uncomfortable that makes people. And I go, I don't need a response to that. I don't need you to make that better for me. Thank you. I need you to not colonize my emotions. Thank you. I want to feel what I legitimately feel, and I don't need anyone to try to make that go away. And so I give people the same kind of respect about their emotions that I would like to have for my own. I hope that's helpful.
You say something, Joanne, in your book about the gentleman who wrote a letter to his child, I think who died by suicide, kind of saying, expressing some of those guilty or feelings of blame. And then I think you ask him what his son would write back to him, which I thought was really powerful, actually.
Yeah.
As a way to kind of get all that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think expression is quite important. And also, being able to process that with a safe person. It doesn't have to be a therapist. It could be a spiritual leader. It could be a teacher. It could be a neighbor you trust. It could be a partner you trust. I think the letter exchange was something I started doing quite early. And once I started integrating my own meditation practice in it, it took it to a whole other level. I don't do it often enough to dilute the experience, but I do. It is a practice that I have. I probably do it once a year or so. Yeah.
There's some other questions about different types of counselling. Actually, I don't know whether you want to comment on those. So, Natalia asks, I'd like to ask if anxieties that arrive following acute traumatic grief are best helped through bereavement counselling or other forms of counselling. And there's also a question about EMDR and whether you have any knowledge of that and know anything about it.
So I mean, counseling with a really, really skilled counselor can be really powerful, really, really potent. And also, I work with a lot of people who have tried a lot of counselors and have not found it to be helpful. And so I say, just be careful and interview people. Ask them what their view of grief is. Ask them what their experience is. Ask them how they feel about grief, and see if it aligns with your personal feelings. Again, sort of going back to this idea that this is holy ground. I think it was Claire's question, about her sister. This is holy ground. This is sacred territory. We don't have to let people in who aren't safe, who don't sort of, in Zen, we say gasho, and gasho is this. It's the ultimate in humility. It's the bow, right? And people who cannot gasho, who cannot bow to our grief and see it as this holy place. I don't let those people into my grief space. They don't get the privilege of knowing about my grief and my trauma and my child, whom I love. And so, be careful, of course, but a good counselor, a really, really good, well-trained, skilled person can be amazing, can really help us to grow in our experience of loss. About EMDR, yes, I know about EMDR. I don't practice EMDR. I don't need to. What I do with people seems to be helpful enough. And I don't dissuade people. Look, whatever helps get you there. I think the key with any kind of intervention is does the person extend compassion and love to you and to your grief? And if that person doesn't, then perhaps that person isn't the right person.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions. There's Sue says, I'd like to ask how we deal with toxic positivity, particularly family. And the latter are the only ones left from my world, my before world. My child's name is Emma.
Emma, thank you, Emma. Yeah, toxic positivity. I love talking about this. You know, in the mindfulness community, this is the circle I run. There's a lot of this happening where people, you know, sort of abbreviate. It's these little sound bites that are quite harmful. Like, just choose joy, right? Just choose healing. Just choose happy. And I was actually having a conversation with someone in the neighborhood about this not long ago. And she was saying, but don't you think people can actually choose to be miserable or choose to be happy? I sort of, my response was this: how about you give me a hammer and I will just break your big toe. And then in the middle of screaming, I'm going to say, oh, just choose happy. All you have to do is just choose happy. We've become such a reductionistic, abbreviated, superficial culture around this sort of, you can put it out there and it'll happen to you thing. I haven't even found a way to speak about it intellectually because it really makes me so angry, because we use it to hurt people. It's like blaming people who are victims of bigotry and racism. It's like blaming them for that and saying, well, you can just choose not to be affected by it. No, you can't. No, you can't, because we are affected by it. We are affected by the isms. And also, when you're grieving, you don't just choose happy or choose joy. It's not that simple. And so the toxic positivity thing, I find it hard to talk about it intelligently, but I will say that I'm equally offended by it. And I will push back against it when I hear it in any public venue. I push back against it. I go, oh, really? Well, what about this person? Yeah. Are you going to tell the people whose children were just massacred that they should just choose happy? Is that what you're going to do? Like, come on, get real, get serious here. Awful, catastrophic things happen to people, and you can't pretend them away or positive them away. It's extremely frustrating. Thank you, Emma's mom. Good question. And also really frustrates me because we use it to hurt people.
Thank you, Joanne. As just a couple more questions. Are you still okay to be with us?
Yeah, I've got about 6 minutes.
Okay, right. One more question then. My son, from Sally, my son passed 2 years ago. It's his 27th birthday on Saturday. I feel so heartbroken that he's been denied a life by the person who killed him in a mindless road accident. His name is Bradley. How do you face their birthday when all you feel is sadness and pain? Those special days are really, really difficult.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Bradley. Yeah, Bradley. So Bradley's mom, right? So he'll be 27 this weekend.
Oh yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
I think my sense about this is that what we really want is to feel some connection to them, even if it comes with sadness and grief and pain. And so I don't know what connects you to him. I don't know what Bradley loved, but if there's something that you can find that helps you turn toward him and connecting with him and making space to spend time with him, not in the way you should be spending time with him, of course, of course, of course. But if there's some way that you can intentionally turn toward him, you know, I have it's called a butsudan. It's a Japanese cabinet, basically. And I keep my daughter's ashes in it, and my parents died when I was pretty young too. So I keep some mementos from them. And as Carolyn knows, you know, my brother just recently died 2 weeks ago. And so I keep things that remind me of my people I love who died in the Butsudan. And when I want to spend time with them, I'm either outside in nature or I'm at my Butsudan if it's in the evening, burning a candle, lighting incense, chanting, praying, just making space for me to create a time for them. If there's a way that you can create a space in your home or outside, if there's a way that you can create space for you and Bradley in nature by
I just think that because it's so raw, you just feel angry. I just feel so sad that he's been denied that, and through no fault of his own.
Yeah.
I have a little granddaughter who was born 9 days after he passed. And his sister, I had to tell her that he died when she was 9 months pregnant. And it's hard. He was my baby.
Yeah. Yes.
And sometimes if I laugh, I feel bad.
Yes.
It's sort of bluntly bloody awful.
Yes. Yes,
and
it is.
Book. I read it about 3-4 months after he passed, and some of the things that people go through is horrendous.
Yeah.
Awful.
Yes.
I just don't know. I think you feel you're the only one.
Yes, it's a lonely experience, and yes, I have felt, and many have felt, guilty for feeling anything other than deep anguish and sorrow and grief. And the way that I work with those emotions is just allow them to be and feel them. I feel the guilt. I let it move. I don't cling to it or push it away. I just notice, oh, you know, I'm really enjoying this. And I'm also aware that there's a part of me that feels guilty that I enjoy this so much. And I just don't cling to that thought or that feeling. I let it move when it's done. Sometimes it hangs out longer than others. But this is, you know, 2 years, I'm 27 years in, right? And, you know, you've been without Bradley 2 years, and this is quite a shock to every cell in your body. You know, everything about you pushes back against this. It's wrong, and it doesn't feel right because it's not. And so I guess I would extend some compassion to you, and just, if I could give you a hug, I would.
Thank you, Joanne. And Sally, there's lots of messages in the chat for you that you're not alone. Many people here have very similar feelings. So lots of love to you. We do need to finish now, but I really want to thank Joanne for spending the time with us, being with us, and her answering our questions, and how inspiring and sort of moving the evening have been. I hope it's been really helpful. I hope that the evening has been helpful for you, and that you found something in Joanne's words or others that you can take away and perhaps build upon in your journey as you try to move forward without your child or your loved one. But perhaps being able to hold them in your heart so that they can be very much part of all you do as you live your lives. I wanted to finish tonight's event by choosing a small piece from Joanne's book to read. There are so many wonderful pieces, quotes, words of wisdom, more or less on every page, so it's really hard to make a choice. But I've gone with this, which comes from pages 139 and 140 of Bearing the Unbearable, where Joanne speaks about a lady called Anne who lost her daughter Barbara. It goes like this: we need others to remember with us. We need compassion. We need empathy. We need to find within us the courage to slowly stretch and strengthen our grief-bearing muscles, so that one day we are better able to cope with grief's weight, and perhaps one day to help another. Find those who are willing to join you and walk with you non-judgmentally. Steer clear of those who claim to have a cure for your grief. Surround yourselves instead with those who admit they have no answers but will enter into the realm of unknowing with you. Seek others doing real soul work and join hands with them, your tribe. Listen deeply, and you will recognize other citizens of the country of sorrow. There are many, and they are beautiful, and you're all here tonight. So huge thanks to Joanne once again for taking the time to talk to us today, to answer questions, take comments, and thank you to all of you for your important sharing and hugely valuable contributions to our evening together. It's been, as always, wonderful to be together, and I always learn something new whenever I'm with you all. And I want to thank you and Dr. Joanne for that. Tonight's talk by Joanne will be on our website shortly and also on our YouTube channel. So if you want to listen again, you'll be able to do so. And Joanne's books, Bearing the Unbearable and Grieving is Loving, are both available for sale from the Compassionate Friends website. Just go to shop and then books on the site. And if you buy from TCF, the proceeds from sales do go to our charity. So that here endeth the advert. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. Remember that all the talks we have hosted since summer 2020 are up on our website and YouTube channel. I hope you'll continue to keep in touch with Compassionate Friends through all the different ways you can access our peer support, through our helpline, our local support groups, our one-to-one support, our grief companion scheme if you live in an area where there's no local support, our specialist online groups, private Facebook groups, online forum, and our unique library of hundreds of books on all aspects of bereavement. Details of all our support is on our recently refreshed and updated website, or call our helpline. Look out too for future events where we can start finally to get together in person. The first of these being our London walk for bereaved parents and siblings on the 22nd of May, and our local support groups, which are restarting in the next few months, hopefully, where possible, in person. We've got a number of other events coming up, which we're still in the planning stages, so do keep an eye on our website and your email inbox for details. Thank you to you all for spending time with Joanne and all of us at the Compassionate Friends. Please know you are not alone. Sadly, as Joanne said, we are many, but we are beautiful. Sending you my very warm wishes and good night to you all.